You're listening to Tonebenders, the Sound Designers Podcast. Let's do this.
Hello and welcome to Tonebenders Sound Design Podcast, where we talk with the sonic artists behind our favorite films, games, and series. My name is Tim Muirhead, and I will be your host today as we talk to a man who is presented with a mission to make an absolutely massive soundtrack for the latest Mission Impossible film, Dead Reckoning Part 1. Luckily, James Mather and his team chose to accept this mission, and the results are glorious. The film features massive car chase scenes, intense hand-to-hand combat, an immense train sequence both in the train and on top of the train, and lots more. This is James' second appearance on Tonebenders after last year's excellent Top Gun Maverick episode. Welcome back to the show, James. It's great to have you back again.
Hi, Tim. It's lovely to be back. You know, I'm a big fan. Thank you.
This is your third Mission Impossible film, is that correct?
It is, yes.
All three of those films have the same director and same star in Tom Cruise and Christopher McQuarrie. They have talked in other interviews about their desire to up the ante for every Mission Impossible film. How does that extend to the sound department?
In every way. They come up with the menu, and then we have to sort of help with the dish. I hope it's served the way they expected it. I think every film has had its own challenges and its own exploration of what what they want to present, and as importantly, how they present it with the storyline. This storyline in this one is particularly acute, as it's seemingly very relevant now, more so than it was when we started this project, which was a few years ago now, due to the pandemic. The jeopardy and the action and the stakes are raised. There's new characters in this movie, which is great. They work fantastically well. And there is also a sense of momentum in this movie that seems to be a progression from the previous two, in a way that the characters have developed into this challenge. And there's humor in this as well, which, although we've had in previous ones, that seems to have increased as well, which is always a nice angle when you've got so much jeopardy and so much at stake. The relief of being able to laugh and see, performances that feel very natural is also an addition to the process. So each time it's amped up something else that then encourages the other elements to equally amp up, if that makes sense.
You mentioned comedy. That's something that I was really surprised by this. With past Mission Impossible movies, you think of action, you think of adventure, you don't necessarily think of laughs. This movie is quite funny.
Yeah.
There's lots of really laugh-out-loud moments in it, and especially the relationship between the Ethan Hunt character and the Grace character.
Yeah.
They have a real chemistry on screen and create a lot of laughs just with their glances at each other.
Yeah.
But there's also moments where sound can create a laugh. And one of those moments is there's a huge car chase scene through the streets of Rome. I think they start in a BMW. It gets trashed. They have to go find a drop car. You're expecting it to be this amazing, super high-tech car, and it ends up being a very tiny Fiat. But for sound-wise, it's rigged to be a modern car, even though it looks old, but it's not really shown. Is it an electric car? Is it a diesel car? Is it a jet car? How did you go about bringing out the comedy of that tiny car and how it kind of works compared to the huge vehicles that are chasing it through the city? Because what you ended up with was both super intense and quite comedic at the same time.
Yeah. It's like Buster Keaton. It goes back to those old movies where it's from the sublime to the ridiculous, and the contrast is what makes it so funny. And the notion that you see the plush sports car, and of course, it's a bit of a slight to other action movie heroes that we know that would have gone for the sports car. Ours gets the Fiat Cinquecento. and what I love about this particular one is that, Ethan is, without knowing it necessarily, he's out to impress. He's out to impress Grace, and they've ended up in this situation where they are tied together, and so they've got to make the most of it. And he's kind of, he's being a little bit, don't you worry, I'm getting an extra car, I'm getting another car, and da, da, da. And the fact that it is all played in counterpoint, and it's actually their humor and Grace's sort of response are so natural, and so the timing that they have together and the acknowledgement that they have of each other's kind of timing, they play off each other so well, Haley and Tom, and you can see they're having fun doing it. It doesn't detract from the story. It doesn't take you away from what is an incredible car chase. But the fact that it's cat and mouse and they are tied together, and it is like they are the peas in a whistle almost. It's like they are in the most impossible car to try and evade such a battle tank of a car, that it was easy for us to make it funny. It's visually, you watch it mute and it's funny. The humor is there in the looks, the humor is there in the design of the choice of the car, the design of the car. So when we went and recorded the actual car, that they had put a Tesla motor into the Fiat to get it to be electric, we went to record it, and it's a quiet engine. It doesn't make a lot of noise, but the car itself made a lot of creaks and groans and metal twists and bangs and sounds tinny and a little bit like the house made of straw. A strong wind would blow it over. We started from the get-go. The moment it comes out, it's got this little squeaky thing, and it kind of stops onto a skid. And there's a character that we immediately associate with that car, which is that it's got bravado and it's got chutzpah, but it's a tiny little weedy car. It's a bit like the kind of Transformers Bumblebee type. It's the smaller, but it still thinks it's got something to prove, which it has. What's under the bonnet is far more dynamic than anything else on the street. And it wasn't hard to play along with that. I think the challenge was really, how small can we make it? How feeble can we make it without it being unrealistic? In order that the Hummer, the car that Paris is chasing them in, is that much bigger and heavier and gruntier and muscular, and that comparison, that contrapoint, is key to so many moments within the chase, like the donutting in the square at the bottom of the Spanish Steps. All those moments where you're just looking at it going, this is utterly farcical, yet totally plausible. This is, if a car was so overpowered, from the get-go, when Ethan puts his accelerator on and goes flying into the shop front, that car was really hard to drive. It's, you put an engine with that much torque in it, in a car that size, it's gonna twitch. So you get that impression. There's a lot of reality in that. That's what made that scene so exciting to play with. It's different. It's not been done before. It's not homage to another film, French Connection, or any other film that has a car chase like that. It is unique, and it is a wonderful vehicle for their chemistry. It not only is it fun for the audience to see this action scene, it's also a really good opportunity for us to see this relationship develop through humor and nuance and surprise, and the fact that they swap places when they don't expect to, and the fact this it's wonderfully choreographed, wonderfully thought out, and brilliantly performed.
And the tire squeals for it, the between the huge Hummer, as you say, that's chasing them, and then the tire squeals when it goes around the corner. It's going kind of little like squeaky squeaks.
Yes.
Were those actual tire squeaks? How did you create those?
Yeah. We recorded a lot of tire squeaks. We have tire squeaks in our library. We found towards the end of the process that the tire squeaks were starting to sound shrill, and it was something that Tom picked up on when he listened to it in one of the previews, and he felt we could step back on some of the comic squealing to allow the character of the engine to be a bit more, but without losing the squeal. So actually, in most cases with soundtracks, you kind of overdo it slightly in order to be able to subtract and take away and expose moments and create timing that works better. You're just constantly dialing it in to improve. We took away some of the very high frequency, the 2K screeches, and what it did is it made it more realistic. It stopped it being slightly comic and made it far more realistic. And it also allowed the engine acceleration out of turns just to be a bit more recognizable. I mean, there's a scene after the Spanish Steps. The car is then being chased through streets, and it's narrowly missing oncoming traffic, and it's going through red lights, and it's at that point you start relying on the other vehicles' skids and horns and physicality to give you the impression that you're in that very small, vulnerable car, and that all the other sounds around you are far more threatening. So the character arc of the sound design for those vehicles changes all the way through that sequence. So you start off, and specifically as the little Fiat goes down the steps, and you hear those as it's shuddering, the tires are squeaking going down the steps, and that was designed to give you the sense that they were trying to control it, not herring down the steps at full pace, but reluctantly ending up going down these steps. And the skids give you that sense that they're not going at full pelt. They're actually desperately trying not to go too fast and crash. And then by the end of the scene, the skids from the Fiat are almost subliminal compared to the horns and the traffic oncoming, which is now another threat. And then you've always got this Hummer that appears out of rear right or rear left, this huge gutsy V8 engine, and it's like having an orchestra. It's playing different frequencies and different instruments at different times to allow the audience to feel that they're compelled and enthralled and engaged. The camera work on these scenes gives you that sense that you are in the car with Ethan and Grace and with Paris. We wanted to make sure that the sound also gave you those different perspectives, low angle tires on cobblestones. It's a really lovely sound, and it's unique to old cities in Europe. And there's always another flavor to give you a sense of immersion within the chase scene. It's not literally just, and as McHugh pointed out when we were doing the skidding scene, the donuts, he's going, it's weird, you kind of expect to hear an engine because you've never seen a car chase with an electric car as the lead. It was like, great, well then we've got to use the skids to make that dynamic kind of urgency work. But then when we cut to the close-up of the car and it's pulling out of a skid, we can use that acceleration of an electric engine, which was in fact a combination of electric skateboards, which have accelerator triggers on a remote, so you can control and vary the speed, and then the designers take those away and work it even more to emphasize. In amongst all the police cars and the sirens and the helicopters, it was a nice thread to be able to weave in and out of the sequence.
So the Hummer that's chasing them,
Yeah,
it feels growly.
it's very growly.
Were there literal growls in there? Were there animal sounds involved?
No,
That was all engine sounds?
it was all engine sounds. There's an artist called Joe Rush. Try and keep this short. He basically takes all manner of vehicles, old Chevys, tractors, cranes, agricultural vehicles, and he chops them all up and turns them into different creatures. And he has a show at Glastonbury. He does Carhenge, which is all these cars laid out like Stonehenge. We did a recording session with him many years ago at Glastonbury Festival, recording his vehicles, that we would then trigger these sounds as they were performing this kind of bizarre kind of motor thing. One of the vehicles was called Rustang Sally, and it was a very old 1920s I want to say V12, but I don't know if that's a thing. There's a huge engine with a flat pipe at the back, and we recorded that, and it was so over the top as a deep growly engine. I've never had the opportunity. I've tried so many times to use that engine in a movie and never found anything that came close to warrant that use until this Hummer came along. And it was a combination of that, Rustang Sally, and a friend of mine who pimped his Range Rover so that it sounds like a speedboat. So we combined those two sounds and then played it through a couple of very fruity plugins, and it gave us Paris's Hummer.
Well, as I say, it was a super fun chase scene for sound. The Fiat, they first smash into a wall out of control, and then almost the next thing is them going down the stairs. And when it cuts to the interior of them in the car, the sound of it squeaking and banging down the stairs was one of my favorite sounds I've heard in a long time. It was really, it was completely unexpected, but it fit perfectly. Normally when something goes kind of off the path, it takes you a moment to kind of settle into it, but like it felt right, but it was not expected. And when you are able to pull that off, it's
You've used the very appropriate word, felt. Felt is to feel it is the mantra of a mission soundtrack. It's something that Tom, being the person in the scene on the screen at the time, having done that stunt, is so acutely aware and eager to share that experience with the audience. He wants the audience to feel the immersive experience that he went through, whether he's hanging off the side of a plane or driving down the Spanish steps. And it's an extraordinary luxury to have, him and Eddie and Macquarie all working together and feeding information into the soundtrack that gives us the opportunity to know where to stay within the boundaries of plausibility, reality, and where we can push the boundaries a little bit because it's nuts, because it's like jumping off a cliff on a bike and then disappearing to almost nothing and then cutting in so loud and so hard. And we're all going, whoa, I don't know. That seems quite extreme. And Tom will say, no, guys, you got to understand. That's how loud it is. That's what it feels like when you're skydiving. We're always very mindful and very respectful of the fact that this guy's experienced most of the things that we're seeing on the screen. And so when you say you felt it, that's the golden word. That's what we're aiming for.
awesome. Well, mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. Touche.
Another big plot point in this film, the bad guy kind of takes the form of AI, and it's called the Entity in the film. And there is a very important scene in the middle of the film, I think it's in Florence at that point, where all of the various players, it's almost like a Western, come in and stare down each other. The Entity is kind of represented by these video walls, but also a sound that's happening. And it's a sound that's happening that I think maybe to an average viewer might even think it's part of the score.
That's right. Yes.
Because it's kind of working with the score, but it's a very abstract sound.
Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe you could tell us how you ended up with that one, how you iterated it, how you got to that.
Absolutely. It's very interesting the way you describe it, because it was very much originally, the Entity was very much a musical proposition. Our composer was sort of tasked with coming up with a theme that would indicate the entity and its presence, and it worked. It was good. It was a good theme, but the entity started becoming more of a visual reference as well, and therefore it kind of became a slightly more of a physical personality on the screen. It was felt that we should also have a go at putting something on there from sound design. I was very keen to, from an early stage, I was very keen to try something because I could see the opportunity there of coming up with something that was interesting and digital and technical and unheard of, but familiar. Anyway, as luck would have it, or not, I had my daughter had called me one day in 2021 saying, "Dad, the TV's broken. I can't hear any sound. It's making a weird sound." So I came home, I put the TV on. There was something amiss with the digital connection to the soundbar, and it was making anything I played through it had the sound that you now hear as the Entity. So I thought, well, this is interesting. I don't know how I'd start making this if I had it, if I was requested to. So I got my phone out and put a mic on it and started recording it. Thought, I know what I'll do. I'll play the opening 5 minutes of Rogue Nation. That's what I'll do, because at least it's it's in the same vein of what we're working on. Did that, skip through, played it. My daughter's there sitting there going, yeah, but can we just, I want to watch, can you fix it? And then, cut to 18 months later, and we'd played around with it, but and I'd done a demo with it as an idea, but it felt like it was too much. It was on the nose. It wasn't the right time for there to be a sound and we were trying to use it at the point in the club that you mentioned, where they're all sitting around and Ethan stands up and looks around the room, and there are visual indicators of something happening. The lights are changing, and we were trying versions of that, and I'd play something to Eddie, and it wasn't the right time to present it. And then McHugh said, have you got anything that we could use for the Entity if we were going to give it some kind of identity on a sound level? And I said, look, I've got this. I'll play you this. And I took the phone out and I pressed the sound, and I said, there you go. Here's the. Hang on a second. I've got this. And he's like, well, that's interesting. I said, yeah, that's the title score. as the Paramount stars are flying in for Rogue Nation. He's going, "Now that's amazing." So we took that 3 minutes worth of recording and we started playing it to the picture, and we added extra elements that didn't work. And actually, the simplicity of that in itself, because it shifts with the sound underneath it, seemed to do all the heavy lifting. And then the entity became a more visual character in the film. We see it at the beginning in the Sevastopol, where you see the entity in the sonosphere, and the screen suddenly twists, and the text on the screen becomes this blue eye that is then the character we come to know as the entity. And at that point, we introduce the sound of the defunct soundbar, which I have to say, rebooting just set it right. Never been able to get it to do it since, which is a shame, because we then had to try and mimic that sound to create a version of, we had one of the sound designers with us, Inos, spent days trying to and successfully achieving a kind of modulation EQ path that we could then apply dialogue through that would sound very similar. It didn't quite have the same rounded edge that does, but it certainly had the same kind of distortion and breakup. So when Benji is giving instructions to Ethan as he's running through the streets of Venice, the transition from Benji talking to the entity taking over, we had to manipulate that, and at the same time breaking up that dialogue and using the entity sound design sound effects to play underneath that, so you knew that it was the entity taking over. And it became quite a signature. And I don't know, for those that may have stayed to the bitter end of the credits, there's a little something at the end which is a entity still around kind of thing. um it's deeply satisfying. It's most sound people, will always be on the lookout for odd sounds that they've never heard, or references that they want to use, and they'll record things. And it's a great lesson. You would never suspect that a something so simple and at the time dysfunctional would end up being such a huge character in a tentpole movie. But there you go.
There you go. That's an awesome story. I love those happy accidents. They're amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another really interesting scene is near the beginning. Ethan Hunt goes to save one of his friends in a desert shootout.
Yes.
During the scene, instead of music, it's almost scored by wind as a windstorm comes in.
Yeah. That had a kind of more of a military tactical feel to it at the early stages, where you had the bounty hunters who were looking for Ilsa, who's holed up in a building with ammunition and weapons to fight them off. But it was that kind of tactical, moving from building to building, encircling and getting closer. And the movie was long at an early stage, and there were a lot of scenes that needed to come down to just be able to tell the story, and to give the audience the sense of urgency. And that was one of those scenes where we tried music had tried a go at it, and we'd tried to go at it, and we tried to combine it. And by the time we got to the final cut during the mix, the scene really could only take one or the other, in as much as the music could only build a certain way. And then McHugh was very keen to emphasize was the insanity of this storm, that it was basically, it's like the opening of Close Encounters, where they come and find all the old airplanes. The nature is trying to obliterate everything on the screen. And so he wanted it to be as violent and as suffocating a soundtrack as possible. So the nuances were really just different locations by a small margin, and the rattling of the building, the derelict building.
Yeah, the scene kind of takes place in like a ghost town in the middle of the desert. So
Yeah.
They're all half up structures. So some have walls, some don't.
Yeah, no, you're right. And as you're kind of coming in and out of the buildings, the wind becomes much more intense and violent. And then you get into a building and then you're hearing it going through the rafters and through the windows. And it was we'd worked this scene many different ways, always trying to maintain this energy. And as the scene reduced in size, it was a very good exercise in discipline. Instead of trying to make the scene that we had started with work by conforming the tracks to match the cut, we had to start again. It was like, okay, no, we just need to get rid of this. We know what the ingredients are. We know what this dish should taste like. We need to make this much of this dish, not that much. And it needs to have the same impact. It needs to have deliver the same flavor, but it needs to be far more succinct and to the point. We can't waste a second trying to, line up something. It is all happening there and there and there. And the gunshots, the gunshots have to cut through, but they also have to give you a sense of perspective as to where people are in that proximity. First thing, it was a discipline to let go of all the work that had been done and say, okay, we start again. We print master in 3 days. Let's get this scene done. And it's like, we've been working on this scene for months and months, and suddenly it's days. We got days, start again, days. This movie, the track layer and the mix on this movie was like the movie. It all came down to the last reel 8.
Wow.
It's like the mix was like the train crash at the end. It was just get through, that's good, that's not good. I think it made for a more energetic and dynamic mix because we knew what we had to play with. We knew that the ingredients and everything was right. It was about everybody letting go of their sense of preconceived ideas of what they thought they were presenting and saying, okay, we're presenting this and this has to be that and it has to have this and that, and Tom wants this and McHugh wants that, and we've got it, but we've just got to stop being precious about all the other things that we've got, let it go, remove those things, focus on what tells the story. Desert Storm was one of those moments. The train tunnel scene was another one of those moments, and they're both fantastic in Atmos, in Dolby Atmos, because they use every aspect without trying to signify that something is moving from front across the roof and to the back. You're not worried about the objects. It's about the density of being immersed in that location. And both those scenes were great for that. They were really, really exciting challenges to make you feel like you wanted to be somewhere else.
Up until this point, I don't think we've done any real spoilers. So anyone listening now, we're going to talk about the end sequence of the film. So if you haven't seen it yet, come back to this point later. We're going to talk about the train, because the train presents a lot of sound challenges, because there's a plot point. The bad guys have disabled the brakes of the train. So the train is going out of control. But and also they've hung the engineer on the string that pulls the whistle. So every time it goes around a bend, his weight shifts and the whistle goes off. But the sound is kind of left to tell the story of the train getting more and more out of control. We don't kind of, there are a few times when we cut to the wheels of the train going faster, but it feels like the sound is telling the story of the train getting faster and faster and faster. I assume your challenge was you can't go too far with that because the people on the train aren't fully aware of what's happening yet.
That's right. That's right.
So how did you thread that needle?
The first thing is to make sure that the beginning of the scene is dignified, expensive, plush, luxurious train journey, which is not uncomfortable, which is not awkward. There's a cut where Paris walks through, and the cut is close up of a champagne flute rocking. And it's like the kind of puddle in Jurassic Park. It's the first indicator that something's not right, that anything in these carriages should be upset or disturbed. Is somehow that's not what the Orient Express is about. It's about luxury and comfort. So we started at a very low ebb, at a low pace, and we didn't try and amp it up. And then slowly, as the story unwinds, the jeopardy of the runaway train becomes more of a feature, more of a storyline. There are ronks and bumps, and the train has, you can hear the screeching as it's going around a corner slightly too far to one side. So it's got this abrasive sound. There are more rattles from the lights and the glasses and various bits and pieces, the chandeliers. The passengers you're not always getting somebody looking up wondering what's going on. This doesn't sound right. It's a bit like they're not as aware of it as we are.
Exactly.
Only when, they come running through and telling everybody that get to the back of the train, get to the back of the train. And we only know that's an issue because they're going towards something they shouldn't be. You don't want to give too much away too soon, but you want to at least make it plausible that it has a beginning and a middle and an end. At any point, if you go back to refer to it, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. It can't just go from beginning to end. And there's like, hey, when did that happen? When did that suddenly kick off? And it went twice as fast. Also, there is a point when we were working on it that we were like, it can't be going faster every time we cut to it. It can't just keep increasing in speed. There must be a kind of velocity that it hits, and that's it. That's the highest it'll go, whether it's 90 miles an hour or whatever it is. it can't go faster than that by the nature of its weight and whatever else. So once we had built up to that speed, which was kind of around the area where Ethan arrives, and we blow out the ambience within the carriage. She's suddenly erupted by this break in, and the outside is now heard on the inside, and you realize, oh wow, it's a lot more violent out there than we were made to think of when we're in the carriage. We're kind of hermetically sealed while we're in the carriage, but when the window's broken, boom, the jeopardy amps up, and then you've got Ethan saying, I've got to go up and sort this thing out on the roof, and Grace, you go and stop the train. It's a runaway train. How do I do that? You can do it. But it's the comic relationship is still strong, even with a few emotional beats. It's still very good. And this is all, there's no music in any of this. This is all about sound design, sound effects. And then when the music does come in, it's kind of got this fantastic train momentum percussion running through it, which I like. It's one of my favorite cues. It's a really sympathetic music cue. That point, you know that the train scene is now going to be something slightly more than just a meeting on a passenger train and a few fights here and there along the way. You've got this rooftop fight, which is bonkers. And again, it's Tom who wants the audience to feel that, one wrong foot and they could be off the edge of the train, let alone being wiped out by a gantry or a signal bell or, signal arm, or there's so many things that could go wrong. And the wind is much like the Desert Storm. You've got this insane wind that is making you aware of how precarious it is on the roof. Thrown into the tunnel for good measure, like a spin dryer.
The tunnel is another one, like I mentioned earlier, about the feel. Like when we went in that tunnel, you felt the whole room changed.
Yeah.
In the theater. It was an impressive sound design moment
that demanded something more than what you would expect to hear. It was one of those moments where you go, okay, we've got all the sounds that we've been listening to, the chuff chuff train, the screeching tires, the whistle, all these sounds. Okay, we'll stick them in a tunnel, we'll put reverb on it, we'll try and find something that makes it sound a bit kind of encapsulated. The whooshing things, they'll have a sound that'll be, I've got a very strong philosophy about how things that pass you make a noise. If something like a bell passes you, you expect to hear a Doppler sound as it comes towards and fires past. But if a light goes past you, you won't get it. You're not going to hear it until it's at you, and all you're going to hear is the whoosh by as it. So non-audio objects, in my mind, shouldn't make a noise until they're with you, and that therefore makes them a lot more alarming because it's like, and these kind of explosive dynamic passes. So we had a lot of variety of that stuff, and we had the kind of train rattling, but it was still very predictable. It was the kind of sounds you'd imagine were the same on the outside of the tunnel, but the tunnel had to be something different. So I delved into the library of sounds that I have of underneath bridges, train bridges, Waterloo, London Waterloo, underneath those where the trains come out, New York, Brooklyn Bridge, where you can hear the tires going over the tracks. Such a known sound. It's such an extraordinary. It conjures up so many other films in my mind. Those New York bridges with dense traffic, and then you've also got these winds blowing across pipes that have this kind of howling, moaning effect. And we just stacked the tracks with all these different thick tonal sounds that had movement within them. It created this bizarre wall of noise that was like you could almost hear. It's almost like when you play pink noise or another tone, a neutral tone, it's your brain starts picking noises out within it that don't exist, but your brain is clearly trying to figure out what it is that is familiar. And it was this tunnel sound that we had the same effect. You'd go, oh, I can hear Ethan grunting here. And he's like, no, dialogues are down, nothing's playing. It's in the backgrounds. It's like you play it again, you go, no, I didn't hear it then. I heard it, but I can hear it there. And it was a really weird omni experience listening to it in the room. And that was what we wanted. It was uncomfortable. You didn't want to be in there. It wasn't something you wanted to. It was like kind of the Ipcris file, is putting a nail in his hand to try and alleviate the distraction that they're putting him under, all this sound therapy and stuff. I was like, yeah, man, I'd tell them all my secrets if I had to listen to this any louder for any longer. And that was the notion, was make it as uncomfortable and as oppressive as possible, so that when we explode out of the end of the tunnel, it's a relief. It's like, oh, they're out, they survived. And then the music comes in and we're off with the emotional, the next level of the chase is the emotional level of the chase, and how that's going to pan out. There were many shapes and forms and dynamics that we had to play with and feel. We had to feel every moment of it. That was the key thing.
The last big set piece, the train stops, the engine flies off the bridge, and then slowly next car is going off the bridge, and our heroes have to get through to the next train. Visually, why those trains keep falling is only referenced a couple times. Sound has to keep that danger alive of the bridge continuing to crumble, the bridge falling apart, the trains creaking as they're tipping off the edge. How daunting of a task was that to take on? Like that's a lot of storytelling to tell off screen.
Yeah, it's a lot of storytelling, and it was the last reel of the movie, and it was a monster. I mean, it was epic. When you see a scene where they've rebuilt these carriages from scratch, and they've built the locomotive for real, obviously it may not have all the moving parts within, but the whole thing is made out of steel, and attention to detail, the hanging these carriages so that the actors are literally pulling themselves up, and you've got the camera operator on a harness dangling down inside this carriage, filming them within a foot of them struggling, and you can see the veins and the sweat. These aren't glory shots for the actors. These are the actors really struggling to climb their way up. The detail and the attention to authentic action is so immense that you just have to keep up with it. It's not like you're trying to explain something that the audience needs help with. What you're trying to do is keep up with what you're seeing on the screen and intimate where necessary, where necessary, the kind of jeopardy that the things that they might hear that we don't see. Like you said, the crumbling stone of the bridge or the creaking of the carriage. So you might cut outside and see the coupling jolt, a bit of a thread, just signifying that they are literally hanging on by a tiny sliver, a margin of risk. But the consequence of that has to have a reverberation, that the train is then and it's got this kind of response to the structure and the strain that's going on outside, and that has to be relevant to what you're seeing with the characters. So we really followed the action. Everybody had a point that they wanted to put across about this. This has to be clear because it has to signify. One person would say, "I really need to hear more of the rubble," and another person would say, "I really need to hear the train groaning." Tom would say, "I need to hear at a point. I need to know that we're that high, and if it means not having the sound of crumbling and groaning and just having that high wind, and realizing that as he's climbing off the carriage that's just about to let go, he is that high, and it's important. These are all flavors that keep the audience on the edge of their seat. The kitchen scene for me is one of the most extraordinary stunts.
This is the train car that was the kitchen car on the train.
The train car, yeah.
They suddenly have to climb through the kitchen with fire flames coming out of the stove. The cooking oil is sliding all over the floor, so they're slipping.
Yeah.
And it's chaos incarnate.
It's dangerous just when it's on the tracks, but this thing's hanging off the side of a cliff. It is fabulous, and it's fun. It's fun to do the way that Eddie cuts it, the way that they've shot it. It's, you've got a squeaky foot on oil floor. You've got the dish machine coming slamming down. You've got gas pipes going, and they're all happening in a sort of synchronicity, in a syncopated way that allows you to feature the sound of everything without it overshadowing the previous or the next. So it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. But that's kind of the movie encapsulated right there in that last reel. It's like, it's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of work, and that's across the board, from the construction to the filming to the rehearsing to every angle of it. So the challenge for us is to match it, and keep the audience engaged and immersed all the way through.
I had a great time watching it in the theater. As I mentioned, the sound made me feel things in ways that were both unexpected and thrilling. Congratulations on all your work. Are you going to be working on part 2?
We are, yeah. When that rears its head, we should be there to jump on board.
Enjoy your downtime.
Thank you.
Because I'm sure you've got another hurricane coming your way.
I believe so, yeah.
Thank you very much for talking to me today. It was really great. Congratulations on the film, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future.
Thank you, Tim. I hope so too. Thanks very much indeed. It was a pleasure.
Tonebenders is produced by Timothy Muirhead, Renee Coronado, and Teresa Morrow. Theme music is by Mark Strait. Send your emails to info@tonebenderspodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter via @thetonebenders and join Tonebenders Podcast on Facebook. Support this podcast. You can use our links when you shop with Amazon or B&H, or leave us a tip. Just go to tonebenderspodcast.com and click the support button. Thanks for listening.
Are you looking for more audio-related podcasts to listen to? Tonebenders is part of the Audio Podcast Alliance, featuring a hand-picked selection of the very best podcasts about sound. Be sure to hear the latest episodes from our friends in the community at audiopodcast.org.